Political commentator Jimmy Dore had this to say on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show yesterday.
We're the ones provoking this war, just like we provoked the war in Ukraine. We are now provoking a war with China. And who benefits? I'll tell you right now. Your enemy is not China. Your enemy is not Russia. Your enemy is the military-industrial complex, which has been fleecing this country to the tunes of hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. How many times are we going to have a defense secretary say, hey, we can't account for $2 trillion in the Pentagon again? Which has happened twice now in my lifetime. So again, people are being the war machine cannot be stopped. Who's running this country? The war machine. It certainly isn't Joe Biden making these decisions.
Head of the Conservative Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, tweeted, Congress needs to put away its kid gloves and put the Department of Defense and other agencies alike under the knife to excise wasteful spending. It is a top priority to save our nation.
A growing number of Americans believe the U.S. is giving too much support to Ukraine. According to The Hill, 26% of Americans think the United States' support of Ukraine is too strong, a new Pew Research Center poll finds. So, a number of interesting things here. You have Jimmy Dore, a YouTuber, I think, formerly considered in good standing on the left.
I think he's a leftist and still identifies as a leftist. He supports Medicare for all and wealth taxes and all of the things.
But, like a lot of other people who were for Bernie, who are on the left, are really frustrated about how much approval of the national security state, the deep state, there seems to be in Democratic circles, going on Tucker, who's like-minded on this issue, and probably several other things Jimmy Dore agrees with, to talk about how the blob always wants foreign policy intervention, is all for this Ukraine exercise when the American people aren't necessarily there. I don't think conservative voters are there. You see that in the poll data. You see that and I'm glad to see, when we talked about your radar today, you talked about spending, and I said, look, some conservatives are coming around on this, or if they were always around, they're being more vocal about it, including Kevin Roberts, who is president of the Heritage Foundation, which is the conservative think tank. It's had, I think, a little bit of an ideological evolution under his tenure to being much less hawkish. In fact, I think they parted ways with some of their national security experts at the think tank because they were very, very for Ukraine at all costs. Kevin Roberts feels differently or knows that what conservative-minded voters and supporters want is a different policy. And yes, defense spending obviously has to be on the table. You sound like a hypocrite if you rail against government spending, but you're like, oh yeah, another couple billion, a trillion for nation building elsewhere. Yeah. Nobody buys that. That's not persuasive.
And Jimmy's right about the Pentagon keep missing money. Like, he can't come up with the funds, can't track its own funds. It's failed the last 5 audits it's experienced. I don't know what other government agency would have such poor financial mismanagement dealing with such huge sums of money and not come under scrutiny by Republicans who sine qua non is focusing on wasteful spending like that.
The Pentagon routinely loses money it's spent in Afghanistan and Iraq that it can't account for. Weapons can't be accounted for. Nobody knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. So I will say about Tucker Carlson, my understanding is that there's a little bit of a mixed bag on his China hawkishness as compared to his Ukraine hawkishness, and there's a number of guests who regularly really seem to be beating the drums of war for engagement with China, who part of kind of the broader Fox News universe. But there is a lot more ideological diversity, especially in this area, on Fox News. And it is very nice, frankly, to see that Jimmy Dore is able to go on and make the kind of argument that he would rarely be offered the opportunity to make on MSNBC or CNN.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine to criticize China. I think it's fine to criticize Russia, too, to be upset with the policies of their government. I'm very upset with the policies of the Chinese government with respect to our own companies here, which when they want to operate in China, have to do self-censorship to appease the communist authoritarians of China. I hate their lockdown policies and everything else, but you're right. That doesn't mean we go to war with them. That doesn't mean our government should have this rhetoric that brings us closer to the brink of war with them. So I agree with Jimmy Dore. Refocusing. We're as American citizens. What can we do? And we should exercise our power as voters, as constituents, to be upset with the war machine. I agree with that.
Yeah, it is frustrating. Also, I mean, Jimmy Dore gets a lot of criticism from folks who say, one, that going on conservative shows is evidence somehow of his conservative allegiances, even though obviously Joanne Reed is not extending Jimmy Dore invitations to come on her show, just as an example. And moreover, they make this argument that when he points out that there, as limited as the energy is on the right for this kind of thing, as you've pointed out, there is more energy, at least from people in power and elected officials, on the right than there is on the left. And that is not a compliment to the right. It's an indictment of the left, a community to which Jimmy Dore belongs, and a warning that if there is not more representation of this worldview, as we saw from the polls, this is a very common plurality kind of worldview in the United States. If there's not more representation of that view on the left, you are going to get people moving right because of this issue in particular.
Yeah. I mean, let's say your main issue, obviously you can care about multiple things, but let's say your main issue is foreign policy, is being against support for war, is, bring the troops home, non-interventionist, against drones, that kind of mindset. Let's say that's your main issue. And that's fair to be your main issue, because that's one of the most significant things our government does is kill people, right? Is make decisions about which governments we should be working with, which we should be trying to overthrow. These are consequential decisions. These are where the president has the most power, frankly. The president is least constrained in matters of foreign policy by Congress. Congress has rubber-stamped the executive administration's behavior on foreign policy is very unconstrained. So it is right to be primarily concerned about foreign policy. If that is your primary concern, and you're what would have previously been considered like a hardcore leftist person on that, which party do you belong in right now? You can make a case that the party you belong in is the Republican Party.
I mean, I think it's complicated.
Or as you said, not the Democratic Party.
I think it's complicated because again, it's a very limited perspective even within the Republican Party. It's not that Republican leadership, with the exception of some folks, maybe Kevin McCarthy, are talking about we have to withdraw from Ukraine. We're not going to write a blank check to Ukraine. So also you have to tease out what is kind of political posturing and what commitments are actually likely to be made by Congress. But the other issue is that it's not just a foreign policy issue. I think part of what's animating the frustration here is that things are going so poorly domestically. So it's people who are frustrated, not just that so much spending is going out the door to other countries, but that there is not the same appetite for spending at home, which is footing that conservatives are on less healthy ground on, because to the extent that some of them will say, okay, we shouldn't spend on Ukraine, they're also not saying we need to use those resources to help Americans be able to afford gas, afford eggs, and the like. Moreover, for many people on the left, I would say that foreign policy is increasingly a defining issue. Many people look at Bernie Sanders being relatively weak in that area as compared to his domestic policy as kind of a warning bell of his unwillingness to fight and being quite as antagonistic to the establishment as people wanted him to be at the end of his 2020 race. And when there are criticized, where they're looking at prospective other left candidates this time around, like Marianne Williamson, it is her foreign policy positions that have caused the most anxiety and conflict, pushback among certain parts of the left, because of her, statements on Israel, for example, not being as strong as many leftists would have liked. It's also worth noting, with respect to Israel, that Anthony Blinken is just visited with Netanyahu, and while he made some statements that were critical of the settlement, he affirmed his commitment, the United States' commitment to Israel over and over and over again. And that, again, is a real sticking point of an issue for leftists and people who are concerned with this issue. So America says, what's the justification for being in Ukraine? A country can't invade another country's borders. This is the line in the sand. We're always going to get involved. Well, the hypocrisy then becomes incredibly acute when you're looking at Israel, who is engaging those same kind of behaviors as Russia, invading, and keeping Palestinians in this open air prison, as it's been described by so many authorities in this matter, and including Israeli politicians, and what justifies America's relationship with Israel on one hand and its proxy war with Russia on the other hand.
Yeah, and what do you have to do to get an actual anti-war democratic political figure when they run Barack Obama ran on the mistakes, calling out mistakes that were being made in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then governed completely differently than that. Then put Hillary Clinton in charge of his foreign policy. And you saw the results. What we got was intervention in Libya, which was consistent with her philosophy. But the seduction of being not anti-war, of being pro-war when you actually get into office is something many Democrats have not been able to overcome. Many Republicans as well, but many of them didn't make the same commitments.
I mean, Obama is the perfect example of why I am skeptical of people who are saying the right things on the right now, because when you are disempowered, if you are even Speaker of a House, when you don't control the other prongs of government, you can say a lot of things knowing that nothing's going to manifest. So it's not to say that I don't want to give credit where credit's due, but it's measured credit, because we've been here before, and I have been close enough to the disappointment of Barack Obama not to put blind faith in someone like Kevin McCarthy.
The tenor of both political parties on these issues does not match what the American people want.
The blob is bipartisan.
More Rising right after this. Stay tuned.